Okay, so we're going to take a look at some composition trig functions. So that just means a function inside of a function. Some of them will be inverse trig functions, and some of them will just be regular trig functions. Just remember, if it's an inverse, we have to take a look at the principal values. So if you look at the first one here, we have arc sine of sine of pi over 6. Okay, guys, composition functions means you have a function inside of a function, and you always start with the inside. So we're going to start with sine of pi over 6. Okay, sine of pi over 6 is not an inverse function, so that means you're just looking at your unit circle. We need to figure out where is sine of pi over 6 on the unit circle. So taking a look at your unit circle here, we know sine is the y value, so we're trying to find where do we have on the unit circle, or what is the y value at pi over 6 on the unit circle. So here's pi over 6. That y value is 1/2. Okay, so sine of pi over 6 is just 1/2. Okay, so now we're going to bring down the outside part. So we have arc sine of this 1/2 we just saw. Okay, this is an inverse trig function, so we need to rewrite it first. So this is the same thing as saying sine theta equals 1/2. Sine is y, so we're looking for where on the unit circle is sine, or the y value 1/2. Now, because we were working with an inverse trig function, we have to worry about those principal values. Remember, for arc sine, it's from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, which means we're looking in quadrant 1, or we're looking in quadrant 4, but if we get an answer in quadrant 4, we have to fix it. So taking a look at your unit circle, we're looking for quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, we're looking for when we have a y value of positive 1/2. So here we have a y value of positive 1/2, and that takes place at pi over 6. So pi over 6 is going to be my final answer there. Now, when you take a look at a couple things, I know that we ended up with pi over 6 is what we started with. So see how this is arc sine and this is sine? This does not always work. Okay, it works sometimes, but it doesn't always work. See a few cases in a minute where it doesn't work. It just depends on what this measure is that they give you here. So make sure you do the inside part first to get that answer. Then you're going to work with the outside part, and then this is your final answer. Okay. So take a look at number 2. So 2, we have arc sine, and then sine of 7 pi over 6. So it's set up like the last problem, but we have a different measure, 7 pi over 6, that we're going to work with. So you're always going to start with the inside. Okay, sine is the y value, so we're going to go on our unit circle. And at 7 pi over 6, that y value is negative 1/2. The answer to that inside part is negative 1/2. We're going to bring down our outside part, arc sine. So we're working with arc sine of negative 1/2. Since we're doing an inverse trig function, we need to rewrite it as sine theta equals negative 1/2. Okay, sine is the y value. So we're trying to look for on our unit circle where the y value is equal to negative 1/2. Now, because we started out with an inverse trig function, we have to worry about those principal values. Arc sine goes from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, which means we're looking at quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. If it's in quadrant 4, we're going to have to fix it. Okay? So take a look at your unit circle, quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So if you notice in quadrant 4, at 11 pi over 6, that's where we have negative 1/2. So we're going to end up with 11 pi over 6. That was in quadrant 4, which means it's too big for our interval. So we have to subtract 2 pi, so we can make it within the interval. We make common denominators. That will give us a final answer of negative pi over 6. So if you notice, this one didn't work. Arc sine and sine can't just cancel each other out. So you always have to go to the inside part first and then rework into the outside part. So negative pi over 6. Okay, looking at number 3. Alright, so 3 we have tangent of sine of negative 1 over 1. Okay, so looking at the inside part, so this time we're going to start with the inverse tangents. So we need to rewrite this. We're going to rewrite it as sine theta equals 1. Because we're working with inverse, we have to worry about our principal values. So for sine, it's negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. If it's in quadrant 4, we have to fix it. Okay, so look at the unit circle. Quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, anywhere in between. We're trying to find where the sine value, and we know sine value is y, so when the y value is 1. So if you look, that happens at pi over 2. Okay, it's not actually in quadrant 1, but if you notice, it can be pi over 2 because it's on the end. Alright, so then we're going to bring down the outside part, tangent. Now, this is not an inverse trig function, this is just a regular tangent of pi over 2. So we know the formula for tangent is y over x. So if you take a look at pi over 2 here, the y value is 1 over the x value is 0. So if you cannot divide by 0, if this happens and you divide 1 divided by 0, or any number divided by 0, that means this is undefined. Okay. If you would have had 0 over 1, that would give you 0. Okay, that's not what we have here. But if you have anything over 0, that's always undefined. Alright, and then our last one for this set. Okay, so we're going to start with the inside. The inside, we just have a regular trig function, cosine of 3 pi over 4. So we're going to look for the x value, because that's cosine. So if you look at 3 pi over 4, the x value there is negative square root of 2 over 2. Okay, so then we're going to bring down the outside part. Okay, this is an inverse trig function, so we're going to rewrite it as sine theta equals negative square root of 2 over 2. We do have to worry about our principal values because we're working with inverse. So for arc sine, it's negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Looking at quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, if it's in quadrant 4, we have to fix it. So if you look here for quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, at quadrant 4 at 7 pi over 4, that's when we have our y value, the sine is y, equal to negative square root of 2 over 2. But that was in quadrant 4, which is too big, so we need to subtract 2 pi, get our common denominators, and we end up with a final answer of negative pi over 4.